Hi there, Herle Burly-ites. What on earth would we be doing in this pandemic without reliable digital connectivity? Well, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, for example. You'd be sitting there with your earbuds in listening to dead air or yacht rock, which is pretty much the same thing. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, recognizes that Canadians have never had a greater need for digital tools to run our businesses and live our lives safely. So TELUS is working to leverage their technology and resources to keep us all connected for good. And they've stepped up those efforts during the pandemic. Their Mobility for Good program was originally designed to give Canada's most vulnerable youth a fully subsidized cell phone and data plan at no cost, as well as training and tools to participate safely in our digital world. During COVID, TELUS expanded Mobility for Good to thousands of frontline healthcare workers at hospitals and long-term care facilities to ensure connectivity with their loved ones. And they've also delivered over 10,000 free smartphones and tablets paired with $0 rate plans to nonprofit organizations across the country, so that devices end up in the hands of those who need them most: isolated seniors, hospitalized patients, and vulnerable young Canadians such as homeless youth. A cell phone is a vital link to support services. To read some truly remarkable stories and learn about how these programs support our most vulnerable Canadians, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, my steadfast Herle Burly-ites, let's get this pod underway. It's another pod in two parts for you today with a very special guest for part one, coming to us from somewhere in the United States. Might be Washington, D.C., might be Alabama, could be an Arby's somewhere on the campaign trail. Don't know. We've got John Anzalone here with us. John is the Principal Pollster for Joe Biden 2020. He's one of America's top pollsters, obviously, and messaging strategists with over 25 years' experience polling for the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, as well as helping to elect senators, governors, dozens of members of Congress, and numerous other office holders up and down the ballot. In the last 2 decades, John and his firm, ALG Research, have helped beat more incumbent Republicans, taking back more Republican seats than any other firm in America. So we're going to talk about taking back an office currently held by a Republican. The battle for the soul of the nation, as Mr. Biden puts it. For part two of the pod, we'll bring on the political panel, the fearless, always on point Jenni Byrne, and this week I'm excited to say we'll be joined by the original rock and roll pollster, political advisor and media pundit Allan Gregg. We'll pick up on my conversation with John Anzalone about Biden, and of course we'll talk about the latest developments in we, not ennui, the French word for boredom, in we, Jenni's word for excitement. Rob Silver and Katie Telford, is this a media hatchet job or a real scandal? We'll also cover the demise of the CERB and the long-term economic impacts of COVID. It's a full show with no lack of opinion, Herle Burly-ites. John Anzalone, really thrilled to have you here with us today. Where do we find you, by the way?
Well, yeah, you find me in Alabama today, which is where I've lived for the last 3 decades, even though I grew up in Michigan. Grew up in St. Joseph, Michigan, and went to college there as well.
Right. How do you find your way to Alabama?
Usually it's like life situations, right? And so had a wife who was then an ex-wife who actually grew up in Montgomery, and so we decided to raise our kids here, and it's been a great journey.
So this is just something that's different about America than Canada. Can you do your job from there? Like, your office is there, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have offices here. I mean, I mostly live here, but when you're a political consultant, as you know, you travel, right? I mean, you go to a lot of places where your clients are. For example, Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, is a client of mine, as are 3 other governors across the country. And you spend time there, not only in strategic meetings, but also talking to voters, right, in focus groups and things like that. So, yeah, I've been able to build a business here, because we also have, an office in Washington, D.C., an office in Chicago, an office in Boston. You have to surround yourself with really smart and talented people. I mean, that's, I think, the success of any business. But at the end of the day, I think that if you give good strategic advice, if you give good numbers, quality numbers, you can do this anywhere. Now, when I moved here in 1994, there weren't many people who didn't consult outside of DC, New York, LA, et cetera. And so it was not something of the norm, and probably took me a little longer to get where I needed to be, but it all worked out.
Well, America is so much more decentralized than Canada because just nobody would get hired from the Prairie Province or from Atlantic, Canada to do the polling for a national campaign. If you're not in Toronto or Ottawa, if you haven't proved your chops there, you don't get hired in Canada. You got to be in the center of the action.
One of the things that was helpful is that I really cut my teeth when I opened my own business because I was in the South, even though I wasn't from the South, is we started picking up and beating incumbent Republicans in the South. And it was a really difficult time. It was the late 90s. It was early 2000s. But we were winning races in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, even Alabama, Montgomery, some tough parts of Florida, et cetera. And so, again, you need a track record. You're in this business. I mean, you have to have a track record. And I think we really got our break in 2008 because the people who were running the Obama campaign, David Axelrod, David Plouffe, Larry Grisolano, these were good friends, old friends in kind of the campaign world. And they brought us in to do the southern states. They brought us in to do Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, which in 2008 were the really tough states, right? The states that no one thought you could win. We wound up winning all three, and we were just a small part of that. But again, being able to do a presidential was really, really critical, and I am forever grateful for that team to, entrusting us with that experience.
I'd like to start off. I understand, John, you had a relationship with John Lewis, and John Lewis meant a lot to a lot of people in Canada. And a lot of people were very moved by both his life and, of course, his passing at a very poignant time in American life. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that when you're in this business, you can get cynical, right? And you can get jaded. And there was really only one person I ever wanted to meet. And it was John Lewis. And I wouldn't say I had a relationship with him. I got to spend time with him that I, cherish. And again, it was because he was such an advocate for congressional candidates, and he would campaign with them. And so some of my congressional candidates, like Gwen Graham in 2014, got to spend an entire day with John Lewis and just sitting there, talking with him, just being in his presence was a big deal. But also because he was from Alabama. Right. He grew up on the outskirts of Troy, Alabama. We were able to have conversations about Alabama because I had lived there. But, he is, in my mind, a true American hero. I mean, this is a guy who has been arrested 45 times. He was, beaten dozens of times. And, he was really courage incarnate. And we're going to miss his voice because it was not only an important one, but it was also, in a lot of ways, in some ways, a kind of a calming one, right? I mean, he believed in peace as the driving force of how he got things done, and it was an honor to spend time with him, and we're going to miss him.
Yeah, it is. It just seemed to come at a time when he might have been needed, the more than ever.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So the choice coming up in November this fall, what's the ballot question for Americans?
Well, listen, when you have an incumbent president, it's always about the incumbent president, right? Are you going to rehire this guy? And I think that the ballot question has really been solidified over the last 4 months during the pandemic. And so it's really about competence. It's about judgment. It's about leadership. And, you've seen the public polls where well over a majority, almost 60%, give Trump a negative job rating on handling the coronavirus. They don't feel that he took it serious, right? That's a bad judgment call. They don't believe that You know, he listened to medical experts. That's certainly a competency issue. And now they don't believe that he has a plan. And so, you know, if you're sitting there in February and you're an American voter, you know, you have the same complaints and bitches about Donald Trump as you always had. You don't like his behavior. You don't like how he treats people. He's a bully. He's kind of a jerk. You know, you don't like his Twitter. You don't like all of that type of stuff. But maybe you like part of his agenda. Maybe you like that he shakes up Washington, or even that he shakes up the media. But now sitting here in August, you know, you're not really thinking just about his behavior. You're judging him in his job as president. And that is where his problem lies, and his failure. And there's, you know, real fissures in his foundation. And I doubt that he can get that back. And so he's being judged as his job as president for maybe the first real time during his presidency, and he's getting failing grades. And so if, you know, re-elections are about the incumbent, then, you know, this is real trouble for Donald Trump. And you see it in the polls.
So the ballot question is entirely a referendum on him. Is that my understanding?
Well, the good thing is that, you know, no, it's not entirely, because, you know, you run against someone. And what I think that's really important is that all of the weaknesses that people see in Donald Trump right now just happen to also be the real strengths of Joe Biden. I mean, his inexperience is really coming out over the last 4 months in kind of his failed leadership. And the trait that is most admired about Joe Biden, if you ask in an open-ended question, is his experience, is his leadership. And so people kind of see that he's the right guy at the right time. And, you know, they project out that this pandemic or this virus is not going to be solved until, you know, next year, et cetera. And that is very helpful for Joe Biden. I think the other thing is that the big vulnerability that Donald Trump is that they don't feel like he has any empathy or compassion. And that, again, is one of the trademarks of Joe Biden.
Where did they get that idea?
He's an empathetic. Yeah, but Joe Biden is an empathetic, compassionate, kind of relatable guy. And that's really important as well. And so, again, you have to have the right alternative, and people feel that Joe Biden is the right alternative, even when kind of it comes to their economic needs. I mean, he is lunch pail Joe, grew up in Scranton. He's relatable on that front as well. And there's a real belief that he's the person who's going to be looking out for working families, while there's already this perception that Trump kind of just looks out for himself, his friends, the wealthy, and the big corporations. So again, all of Trump's vulnerabilities are countered by Biden's strength.
When I was watching the primaries, John, it felt to me like there were two Democratic parties. There was a traditional Democratic Party that was fairly moderate and wanted to beat Trump, and thought that the number one overwhelming job of the election was to defeat Trump. And then there was a second Democratic Party that wanted to remake American society in a fundamentally different way, represented obviously by Sanders and Warren and a number of others. Is there any turnout or motivation concern if you don't put that kind of bold change agenda forward?
Well, I think there's a couple things here. Is that, you know, first of all, the Democratic Party in America is a really big tent. It's not homogeneous. It's not just, quite frankly, just a bunch of, you know, almost all exclusively white males, which the Republican Party is. There's some females and et cetera. But at the end of the day, there's not a lot of diversity. And, you know, the Democratic Party in America is a really diverse group of people. I mean, if you take a look at the Democratic caucus in the House or the Senate, it is really diverse. And that means that there's going to be family disagreement, even in terms of not only policy, but also about where you go as a party. And in some ways, Biden is the perfect person to bridge that in a transition as well. I think that the one thing that you get out of the primary that's kind of a myth is that Biden isn't a progressive, and he has said that, right? I mean, he has come out with an amazing array of plans that a lot of them will be transformational. He spent 4 weeks coming out with his economic recovery plan for working families and small businesses. And quite frankly, again, the slogan of it was Build Back Better. So this isn't about going back to where we were. It's about understanding that there's real inequalities in the economy for not only working families, but also for African Americans, Latinos, small business people, et cetera. And so I think that, again, he's looking to build something that looks very different than what we're looking at today. And I think that that's really important. And as people and young people get to know Biden a little better, I think that they're gonna see that. I also think that young people see what is at stake, and their number one priority is to get rid of Donald Trump. And I think we're going to see a lot less third-party voting. But we have to earn that. I mean, and I think that Joe Biden understands that he's out there for the next 3 months earning that right to get their vote.
Okay. What do you think Trump wants the ballot question to be?
He wants the ballot question to be, scare America, right? I mean, that's just kind of the only lane that he ever is really in, and the only lane that he understands. I mean, division is what he believes is kind of the strength. And I don't think that it's going to work this time because people view Joe Biden, as you said, as a moderate, but they also just don't view him as very scary, right? We've had, I think, times where voters have viewed the Democratic Party as scary, and they see him, again, as not only someone with experience and who's relatable, but more importantly, they also see him as a person who, has worked with other groups and coalitions and parties to get things done. And Americans know one thing, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, is that you have to come together to get things done. And they're really ready for that. And Trump has basically had 100% of his TV ads beaten Joe Biden up with no success, right? I mean, really hasn't moved the numbers at all because he is not the type of candidate where voters are going to believe it. They have an impression of Joe Biden. They know him. He is not new to them, and they're not going to kind of take the attacks hook and line and sinker like they have in past.
It's interesting. I'd like to ask you, John, because I've seen you quoted a number of times along those lines. You feel that Americans have a knowledge and a comfort level with Joe Biden that makes him somewhat immune to these kinds of attacks and attempts to take him down. Do you think that voters really have that kind of an intimate attachment to politicians, or aren't most people more cynical and sort of think all of them are deeply flawed people? Yeah,
and I would not say it's intimate. Very rarely do they have an intimate relationship. What they do have is a visceral, and people's visceral reactions are important. And people's initial take on Joe Biden is that he is a good guy, right? That he's an honorable man, that, again, he's compassionate and empathetic and experienced. And so, listen, voters know candidates at all different levels. They certainly feel that they know Donald Trump, right? I mean, 60% of voters believe that this guy cares more about the wealthy and, big corporations, or cares about himself than them. Gosh, I saw a number, 68% of voters in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania don't think that he handles himself responsibly. 60% of voters think he's a liar. Over a majority of voters think he's a racist. So again, they know him maybe at a more intimate level, and it's probably why I think in a NBC poll, 50% of voters said that there was no chance at all that they would vote for him. So listen, in the next 3 months, it is always the job of a campaign for and the candidate to get to know the candidate better. And I think that's what Joe Biden is doing. And, almost all of our TV ads are positive, talking about who Joe Biden is, what he's done, his economic recovery plan, his COVID plan, So they're getting a lot of information about Biden on the positive side, and they're getting nothing on Trump. And I think that's important.
There was once an election in Canada in which the campaign manager didn't want to expose the leader of the party lest he blow the lead, and so kept him hidden through the whole election campaign, and the strategy became known as low bridging the candidate. That was a famous guy in Canada named Pierre Trudeau, who was low bridged. But anyway, you appear to be low bridging Biden. Is there any risk to that?
Well, I disagree with you. I mean, we're, playing by the rules of medical experts, right? Joe Biden believes in science. And so he's being responsible, not only for himself, but for his staff and for, voters. I don't think that anyone now feels that the Tulsa rally for Trump was a responsible thing to do during a pandemic. I think that you see Joe Biden give interviews every day. I think that you see Joe Biden give some really good major speeches over the last several months. And so in a way, he's playing by the rules of a pandemic. Most people would say that handcuffs him, doesn't help him. He is the type of guy who loves to be with voters. I mean, I was with him and traveled with him his last 2 days of the Michigan primary in March. And this is the guy who wants to touch real voters, have conversations with real voters, and engage. But you just can't do that during a pandemic because it's irresponsible.
And you feel that you can get through television and I mean, I'm just asking you not about whether, I'm asking you about the perception. Do people think he's hiding? No, I don't think we see that in any way. I don't think that you see it in the public polls, and I don't think he would be, leading by 8 or 10 points in every battleground state if voters felt that it was. We used to call, I think, back in the 1800s, it was the front porch strategy. You wouldn't leave your front porch if you were a presidential candidate. I think you said low bridge. But no, I don't think that. Matter of fact, I think that what you see is people think that he is responsible. They see him wearing a mask, and for some reason it's so difficult for the president of the United States to wear a mask. And so they feel that what Biden is doing is not hiding. What he's doing is responsible. And again, you have to remember that he's out there every day. I mean, he's out there giving interviews every day. He's out there, giving speeches, major speeches every once in a while, and doing events. I mean, what most people don't see is how many events that he does. It's just like this. I mean, it's really over Zoom. And there's town halls in almost every battleground state. So he's actually out there engaging with voters. Okay, interesting to know. I didn't know he was that active. I guess falling right to the narrative that he was.
You would not believe his schedule, and you wouldn't believe Dr. Biden, Jill Biden's schedule. I mean, she is unbelievable and such an asset to this campaign, and she is everywhere. So she, like often presidential spouses, will have another entire itinerary, and she does an amazing number of events every day.
All right. So who are those events aimed at, John? What percentage of the electorate is actually in play here, and who are those people?
Well, I think that, it's not a secret. I mean, you can see where both campaigns kind of communicate on TV and digital and mail and radio, et cetera, and where they have events. And again, these are virtual events. In the United States, it's the upper Midwest, it's Wisconsin, it's Pennsylvania, it's Michigan. In the Southeast, it's North Carolina and Florida. In the Southwest, it's Arizona. Those are the key battleground states. We're also communicating in Nevada, which has been a traditional battleground state as well. We're doing some markets, which is public, in Ohio. Interestingly enough, Trump, because he is in trouble, is not even, he's actually communicating in places that he won big. So he's communicating in places like Ohio and Iowa, but not communicating at all in places like Michigan. And so he's playing a defensive strategy, and we're playing an offensive one. And we're very focused on, 270. We have to get 270 electoral votes. as well.
What kind of person, though, John, could still vote either way? It's almost inconceivable to me. So, but so much of this Trump business is inconceivable to Canadians. But what kind of person is still going, I don't know, right? One day I'm Biden, one day I'm Trump.
I mean, I'm not out there judging undecided voters. I mean, that's part of the political process that you and I deal with all the time. And they tend to be, guess what? Disproportionately independents. And so, in America, depending on the state, you can register as a Democrat or a Republican, or if you can't register as one, you identify as a Democrat or Republican. And then there's a third of the voters who, say, sometimes I vote Democrat, sometimes I vote Republican. And so it's not unusual for for undecideds or persuadable voters to be a little bit, to be disproportionately independent. And it's not unusual for undecided or persuadable voters to be a little younger as well, because, they tend to engage in the process a little later than most. And if you're a senior, you tend to be a little bit more, set in your ways, if you will, about where you're going to vote.
Right. It's just hard for me to understand what somebody who hadn't drank the Kool-Aid and was deeply embedded in his base, what a person would find attractive about his candidacy. But that's just, let me take it to a very particular place. One of the things that I was so struck by in 2016, and I gather some progress has been made on this, but it's still remarkable, how many women voted for Trump. I mean, you and I both know as pollsters that women have very, very different and generally more progressive perspectives on politics. And they also have an increasing sense of themselves and their status in the world. I could not have predicted that Trump would do well among women, but he did very well among white women in 2016. Yeah. And is that a case of race trumping gender? Or what was going on with those women?
Well, listen, I think that what's important is if you look at white women, and particularly if you look at suburban women and college-educated women, Joe Biden is getting up to 60% of the vote in that universe. And he is also the type of candidate where he's going to get a much better share of non-college educated women than even Hillary Clinton, right? And so, again, it takes, every candidacy has its own coalition, if you will. But a big part of Joe Biden's coalition is suburbanites and college-educated voters and independents. And that's a group that Trump won all three of those. And so did Romney, right? And this is not unusual for those groups to be Republican. What's unusual is that a Democrat is winning all three of those demographics. And so, I don't think that people know that there was a pretty big universe of people who were taking a chance or a risk on Trump. And we saw in our 2018 midterm elections, particularly with women and suburbanites and college-educated women, that they flocked to the Democratic Party in almost a revulsion to Trump. And they're doing that as well now. So it's always where you wind up, not where you begin. And I think that's what we're seeing.
The Republicans splintering. You get things like the Lincoln at least at the elite level, you get things like the Lincoln Project happening. People are writing about the end of the American era. How much responsibility do you feel working on this campaign? Like, I always feel an enormous amount of responsibility when I lose to a garden variety conservative. But there does seem to be a whole lot at stake for the whole world in this election. How does that feel to be part of that?
Yeah. Listen, I don't think that what the stakes are, how high the stakes are lost on any of us. From the top consultant and staffer to the field organizer calling people in North Carolina. This is maybe the most important thing that I will do or that any of us will do in our lifetime. And we feel a huge responsibility and a weight on our shoulders, without a doubt. And that's why it really doesn't matter what the polls say. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, we're not gonna get overconfident. We're not gonna take things for granted. We're gonna work kind of every demographic group that was trouble, including some base voters, right? In 2016, we're going to work every group incredibly hard because it's cliche to say you're going to, run like you're behind, but that's what you have to do when you have what is at stake, and you have the collective PTSD from 2016.
Right. Do you think under this president, some version of an manufactured October surprise is more likely than not?
Well, I think that this is a campaign and this is a party who is going to be prepared for everything. I mean, you've seen stories, because
your opponents are prepared to do anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I mean, if you just see the TV ads that he runs right now, I mean, they're, almost all filled with falsehoods or outright lies or scare tactics. You've seen stories in the last 48 hours about, Russian interference at the exact same level that the Trump administration has done nothing about at all, and that there's also potential interference from Iran. So listen, I think that, again, we are wise or wiser than we have ever been, and we're on the lookout for anything that might come our way, and we're going to protect ourselves and this candidate in these elections. I mean, this is a opponent who has a complete narrative campaign against mail-in voting during a pandemic. I mean, think about that. He is suing the state government in Nevada because they want to make it easier for people to vote by mail to keep them safe. And so you can expect anything and everything, and I think we will.
Well, they're trying to delegitimize the election, correct?
Absolutely, from the very beginning.
Yes. It's not a confident strategy, but it could be quite a divisive strategy. So if I could just ask you to take your campaign advisory hat off for a second and give us a broader analysis. So, to go back to familiarity with politicians, I think people around the world are probably in many respects more familiar with Trump than they are with their own leaders because he's so prominent, he's so dominant, and he, I mean, by the polling that I've seen, he would be a marginal political figure in any other Western democracy. And in Canada, against Hillary Clinton, would have gotten about 20% of the vote. So even if he loses in November, he's going to have lost with roughly 45% of the vote, give or take a few points. Isn't something that should worry people about America? Does it worry Americans about America? Who are those people that think that after 4 years of this, that he's still a good idea? I mean, they must be so profoundly alienated from the world as you and I understand it. It's a very curious phenomenon for me.
No, listen, I think here's what's important. And again, I'm not one to make judgments on who individual voters are going to vote for. And I think that, Biden has said this, that he's going to be a president for everyone. And that will just be a different approach than Donald Trump, because you get to feel that he is not a president for everyone, that he's a president for a very small universe of voter. And that, Biden is going to be that person who's going to heal the nation, bring people together, and, again, have empathy and compassion and kindness, but at the same time realize that there's just a lot of work to be done, right? I mean, that you kind of have to put that all behind you and get the work that needs to be done. And, we're in multiple crises right now. And so, I think Joe Biden's going to be a breath of fresh air. I think the Republican Party has a reckoning. They are going to have to come to terms with the fact that they embraced this guy for 4 years. And that's going to cause them a lot of problems because they're about to potentially, I think they will, lose the U.S. Senate because of their embrace of Donald Trump, and they weren't independent of him. And they weren't courageous to, call him on when he did things wrong or mishandled things, et cetera. And we're about to probably see the House of Representatives expand even more for Democrats. So voters will do the reckoning, right? And then the party will have to deal with how it's going to kind of restructure and heal and move forward. While they're doing that, I think we as Democrats are going to set the tone, not only for, in America, but also diplomacy and how we act with our allies. And that tone is going to be much different than what we're seeing today.
I look forward to that. Those of us who watch this, I want you to help give us a couple of signposts as we go through this. Trump, of course, has blown up the traditional news cycle and generates at least one, if not more, news stories a day. And I watch the cable networks as they go whack-a-mole after these things, and I go down the rabbit hole with them and all that. But it always has felt to me like that's an advantage for Trump because nothing ever sticks. People never focus on anything long enough to truly understand it. And you move on to the next one, and it almost becomes like entertainment. As we watch him do his shtick, what's important and what isn't important?
Well, I think that shtick was not as detrimental to him in February as it is now, because as he does that shtick now, it is harmful to him because what American voters want right now is they want a leader who's going to take control and have a plan to tackle the pandemic. And that hasn't happened. And we're now not only in a surge, we're in a surge that's almost a month long, and voters don't believe that this guy has a plan and that he doesn't, really take it serious. And so, his shtick doesn't work when how voters are judging you is on how you're doing as president of the United States. Right. And that is a big problem for him. I mean, he is purely being judged on his competence and his actions as president of the United States, and he's falling down in the job, and that is what is his biggest vulnerability. And he doesn't seem to ever be able to kind of repair that. He keeps doing the shtick, and that's his problem.
Right. All of the behavioral stuff is baked in now, though, right? I mean, anybody that's going to be offended by him has already been offended by him. There's no value in continuing to point out what an obnoxious person he is.
Well, I think that we always think that he's hit bottom, and we always think that we can't be surprised. And then we're surprised. I mean, some of his worst job performance ratings was during the police brutality environment and protests, where 60-something% of America felt that his remarks and actions made things worse, that it was divisive. And so you could have said the same thing a month and a half ago, and yet he still says things, racist things, doubling down on kind of racist Confederate stuff and that you're like, oh, okay, I don't think that he can go any lower. And then he goes lower. And so, I'll never take off the table that, all the behavior is done.
No, I guess there's always a surprise in him that way. You raise a super interesting example. He doubled down and bet that white voters would react to what was going on in the aftermath of Floyd George like it was 1968. And white voters did not react like it was 1968. That was encouraging to everybody. What's changed?
What do you mean what's changed?
Why were people so much more sympathetic to the protesters than Trump expected? Maybe anybody knew that they would?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is my personal belief, is America lived through the death of this man. I mean, on video for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And so it was, I think for whites, the first time in some ways that they're like, okay, there's a problem that's bigger than I ever imagined in the criminal justice system, in policing. And, we're in the age of video, but this was so horrific and the fact that the white police officer literally nonchalantly had his hands in his pockets, while, this man was dying, while he killed his man. And so, without a doubt, I think that was a wake-up call, that not unlike what we saw in the 60s at a very different level with Bull Connor using, fire hoses and dogs on children. And so it, I think, shook the consciousness of America. And he, again, doubled down on, his racist comments and insensitive comments. I mean, at that point, America wanted a unifier. They wanted someone who could heal. They wanted someone like Joe Biden, who gave
them George Wallace
speech. Yeah, and he gave him George Wallace. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Election night. What should we be looking for?
Well, unfortunately, because we're in a pandemic, on election night, you're going to be looking for another week potentially or so on what you're going to for election results. Mail-in ballots are going to be at historic highs. Most in America, you can't start counting absentee and mail-in ballots until I guess the election day or the polls are closed. I can't remember which it is. So, we've had some late primaries here in the pandemic where it's taken over a week to get election results. And so election night is going to be just another day in this campaign. But what we don't know is how many more days there will be after to get results. Now, maybe we'll know. Maybe we'll know that night, and that would be fantastic. But I really don't know what to tell you to look for on election night, other than maybe a good bottle of wine or some beer.
Wine does not cut it with Trump, man. You need some whiskey at a minimum, rum or whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. There you go. Double barrel.
Listen, you've got to be the busiest guy in America. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
One last thing. Who's the VP?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, just like everyone else in America, I do not know. It's kudos to this campaign for keeping it very tight. Our convention is next week, so this is not unusual, in American politics, for it to be during this timeline. So
No.
I'll know when you know. Thanks so much.
Great. I'll look forward to it. John, Godspeed to you. Bye.
Thank you, brother.
If we've learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what is happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. During a crisis, the importance of governments increases dramatically. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Hey, Herle Burly-ites, if it's Tuesday, it's got to be the Herle Burly political panel with the indomitable Jenni Byrne. And today, sitting in our third seat, normally held by Scott Reed. Allan, you're a friend of Scott's. Do you know where Scott is? We can't find Scott anywhere. We're joined today by Allan Gregg. Allan Gregg is a legend of Canadian politics, and certainly a legend to me, along with Martin Goldfarb, the founder of the modern polling industry in Canada. All of us who've come after have been shaped by his work and his model. And Allan, thank you for joining the panel today. It's great to have you.
My pleasure.
Jenni, welcome back.
Hi.
You're well today?
I'm great. Things are great.
Right. Were you a fan of the Tragically Hip?
I like some of their songs. I wasn't a huge fan. My sister was a huge Hip fan, but I like some of their stuff.
Do you know that Allan Gregg was the manager of the Tragically Hip?
I did. I saw that. I did know that. That is actually very cool.
Yep. Very cool. Allan, tell us a Tragically Hip story.
Which one do you want?
Well, if you don't come up with a good one, I'll have to make you tell the story about how you turned down Shania Twain.
Oh yeah, I won't tell you that one. We signed them before they'd even. We signed them before they'd even written an original song. They had a friend who, in fact, it was Hugh Stiegel's brother. Had a degree in landscape architect, was a good friend of the band. He said, "I'm really afraid that my brother-in-law is wasting his life hanging around with these guys. Will you tell me if they've got any hope of doing anything?" So he sent me a tape. I listened to it with my partner Jake Gold. Said, "This is really good. Let's get them up." They opened up for a Rolling Stone cover band in Larry's Hideaway. We looked at each other within 30 seconds and said, "We're going to sign these guys." We signed them that night at the Pilot Tavern. You have to look at Gordon Downie. He just said at the Pilot Tavern that night, yeah. And I said they hadn't written it. And so we managed them for over 2 years before they made a record. We made their first record, and then the label that picked that record up, RCA, didn't want to do another record, and we had another 2 years. So it was 4 years before they got their deal with MCA that broke with Up to Here. So it was a long slog, but and it goes to Gladwell's, outliers. I mean, they had worked 10,000 hours before they actually got a deal. They were like the Beatles in Hamburg, and they had played every shithole in North America by that time. So they were ready.
Well, they had an unbelievable career, huge in this country, absolutely huge. Speaking of the music theme, I am wearing, and I don't think Jenni's old enough to recognize this, but I'm wearing the classic Maxell logo, the classic Maxell image. And Jenni, if you were in the 70s and 80s and you were making a mixtape for your girlfriend and you really loved her, you used the Maxell UDXL2 cassette tape, the best of all the cassette tapes back in the day. Maxell was the gold standard.
I'm old enough to remember cassette tapes and Maxell. I used to tape songs off the radio. So the start of the song would be the DJ talking, and the end of the song would be the DJ talking, but you'd have kind of the middle. Yeah.
Either that or the needle landing on the vinyl. Are you pumped about the Habs, Jenni? Seriously, here we go against Philadelphia. I'm a bit worried. Philadelphia's had their number in the playoffs for as long as I can remember, and Philadelphia's had a really good playoff. So I will be cheering. I am trying to stay optimistic, but I think it's going to be really tough for our Habs. Yeah, I know. I remember one playoff not that long ago where some legend named R.J. Umberger for the Flyers made Carey Price look like Frederick Anderson. I interviewed Biden's pollster, John Anzalone, yesterday, and you both had a chance to listen to that. And obviously, he has to be pretty careful about what he says, but I thought that there was some things that could be gleaned from that. First of all, I thought he sounded pretty confident, didn't you?
Yeah, he did. I mean, he did. He sounded very confident. We've all been there before. That when we're supporting a candidate and we end up in a public posture, you have to gild the lily a little bit. And he focused on the fact that all the polls show that Biden is 10 points ahead. What he didn't really talk about is that among male voters, he's only tied. Among those over 45 years of age, he's only tied. That among voters who have less than high school, he is trailing. Among white voters, he is trailing. That's a pretty big swath of America. In addition, Biden voters are far more motivated to vote against Trump, whereas Trump voters are far more motivated to vote for Trump. Trump voters are way more enthusiastic about voting than Biden voters. So he's got an uphill battle. This is far from over. And the Democrats have got a pretty abysmal track record of misreading the public mood and not really understanding all of America. So we'll see. There's still 3 months to go.
I agree. There's a lot of. Yeah, listen, I agree with Allan. There's a lot of runway left in this campaign, and to Allan's point about Democrats or voters that are voting against Trump, it's very hard to get those voters out. If their sole motivating factor is to vote against something, it's actually harder to get those voters out. People to get your voters out when you're actually on the ground and trying to get people out to the polls. If someone's sole motivating factor is to simply vote against something, it's actually harder to get them out. They can be very angry, but when it actually comes time to voting, it's going to be harder for the Democrats to get those voters, the anti-Trump voters, actually out to the polls.
Well, I sort of raised that with them when I said, are you worried about the turnout among the Warren-Sanders wing of Democrats if you don't have any positive agenda in the window, if you don't have any sort of New Jerusalem for them to aspire to? And he was pretty dismissive of that, counting on the fact that the antipathy toward Trump would drive that turnout.
The thing, Jenni is absolutely right. I mean, when a voter is motivated negatively, they're not as motivated as if they are positively. Add to that a lack of enthusiasm around Biden. The two are there, and he could have a turnout problem. But the larger problem is with, I think, the Democratic Party. I mean, Gwynne Dyer had a fantastic line years ago. He said, Canadians have no frame of reference for understanding America because half of it is exactly like Canada, and the other half is exactly like Tehran. We don't have any equivalent to Biloxi, Mississippi. Red Deer is more like Boston than it is Shreveport. You have vast swaths of America that are undereducated, that are poor, that don't have adequate access to health care. It is like a third world. And as a consequence, you have, for example, in the recent YouGov Economist poll, a massive study that they have just done a presidential election, among many, many other things. It asked whether you believe that Donald Trump is honest or a liar, to which 31% say he is honest. You think about that. This is a guy that the Washington Post has documented lying publicly 28,000 times. 1 out of 3 Americans continue to believe that he is honest. Ask the same question, do you think Joe Biden is honest or a liar? 38% say he is honest. So he's leading by 7 points against a guy who has lied 28,000 times. I think I'd be doing a little bit better than that. That is America. That is America. And the Democratic Party doesn't understand that. I mean, when Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, I don't think she was misspeaking. Thomas Frank wrote a fantastic book in 2004 called What's the Matter with Kansas? And his starting premise was, I don't understand this. Voters in Kansas, farmers, vote Republican, a party that supports Wall Street, that is tax cuts advantages. So he went down to Kansas to find out why they voted Republican. And he came away and said, you know why? Because Kansas farmers believe that Democrats would rather hang around with Steven Spielberg than me. And they look down their nose at me. And the Democratic Party just doesn't seem to, the notion that the Republicans could be winning among poor people and people with lower education. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be rolling over in his grave. They have completely lost sight of that kind of blue collar constituency that swings all of these states that they need to get back in the White House.
Well, there was the articles that came out after the 2016 campaign that talked about the schism between Hillary's campaign staff and Bill Clinton on the plane, saying, "You've got a touchdown in Michigan, we've got a touchdown in Wisconsin," and the campaign staff going, "Oh, we've got the demographics, we've got the data. Bill, you just go to the back of the plane and come out and wave. We've got this covered." And they continue to do that. But in terms of making a difference, there are things that Trump has done that the Democrats actually don't like. He has last month he signed the executive order making pharmaceuticals that stop the pharmaceutical companies from gouging on things like epinephrine and insulin, making so people like low income people that were having to pay $500 a month for insulin or not being able to afford it at all. It's reduced to like $100 a month and making it more affordable. So it's policies like that that the Democrats don't seem to understand that Trump and the Republicans are doing that is going to appeal to this constituency that you're talking about.
I thought, in a sense, Jenni Allan validated your thesis the other day in the interview when you used to claim, you have a bet with Scott Reed on this podcast, that Trump would win the election.
Yeah.
And post-COVID, you have not been saying that. You've been thinking that he's likely to lose the election post-COVID, and you've kind of written off your bet. And
I haven't written off my bet. That's not fair.
I thought, listening to Anzalone, he was placing a lot of the case against Trump on COVID. That he seemed to indicate that COVID was a turning point in Trump's electoral fortunes.
I think
Is that going to be the case?
It might be. I think that he's doing better now than he was 2 months ago. I think that he's not where he was 6 months ago. I've said this before. Part of the reason he was doing as well as he was the economy. Before COVID, the U.S. had a 3% unemployment rate. And so I think he, like all sitting politicians, regardless of the political stripe, are going to have a very hard time in re-election post-COVID as the economic ramifications of everything that's happened over the last 5 months come to fruition.
COVID has allowed the Democrats finally to get it half right. I mean, again, the problem with the perspective of a Democrat is that they find the character of Donald Trump so odious and just that they can't stop focusing on his character. His supporters don't care about his character. This is a guy who's just, I'm going to grab him by the pussy, and people went right to the polls and voted for him. His Achilles heel is competence. And what the Biden's guy said on a number of occasions, he says, they are going to judge him on his performance as president. And what COVID has done has demonstrated a lack of competence, not just, a character flaw in him. And if they can establish that this guy is a serial failure, this guy's got a vocabulary of someone who's in grade 8. He has never managed, he doesn't understand anything about the operations of government, and the entire world is laughing at him. Then they've got a chance to beat him. But he loves these diversion tactics. He loves the fact that if he tweets out something stupid, that day they're talking about the stupid thing he tweeted out, rather than his failure as executing public policy and from the White House.
I think the Democrats...
It's very, very difficult to determine the immediate from the important with him.
Yeah, but if the Democrats are going on competence, they're running a candidate that seemingly at times doesn't even know where he is. Like I think that would be a mistake if their entire ballot question on Trump is competence. Like every interview, like it's the media hide it, but like his interview, the last interview, like there's been a series of interviews where it has actually been sad to watch. It's almost like are his family not basically saying he should not be playing at the level that he is in politics. That if you saw last week, he had a campaign aide that had to like literally arm him out of a campaign event onto the bus. He had he was doing an interview where he asked the interviewer if he was a junkie. Like, did you do cocaine before this interview? And so I think that if the Democrats think they're going to win this election based on a ballot question of who's more competent, that is very good news for Trump.
Yeah, again, it's you're not wrong at all. I mean, I think that Biden is a liability, and I think his mental acuity is a real issue. And again, if you look at these numbers, he is not scoring particularly well among anyone other than the African American community, who truly like him and truly believe that he has their back. Someone said the other day, says, could you imagine if Biden stepped forward and said, you know what, I'm 78 years old, I'm really not up for the job, I'm deferring to Andrew Cuomo. It would be over tomorrow. In a flash, the election would be over. If there was someone who really had an established record of competence, Trump is very, very vulnerable.
Well, Cuomo, this is if we're going to get into like COVID, he's the worst. He's the governor that I think has responded the worst. Everyone has said what a great job he's done, and he basically was putting elderly people back in nursing homes that had COVID out of spite because he didn't want to use one of the ships that Trump put in the harbor, the ICU ship. So. Everyone has this false narrative that I don't understand as to why saying that New York has done such a great job during COVID and Cuomo was so great, and there's zero evidence to actually back that up.
Well, there is evidence. You look at the numbers in New York City versus Miami, and there's no comparison. I mean, they have been able to stamp it out in New York, and it's just flared up everywhere else in America.
But it never flared up the way that it. But it never flared up the way that it did in April in those states. So what we're going to say that the high level of the thousands of people dying a day in April didn't mean as much as the fact that those like states like Florida never got there in April and April, end of March and early April, and are not at the level even now that New York was then.
Well, to get back to Trump being Biden being a bad candidate, which is really sort of at the center of whether or not Trump has any chance to win, because he shouldn't if he's against a strong candidate. I mean, it's tempting to forget just how brutal a candidate he was for the nomination when he was running, and he was losing that race decisively, and it took all the king's horses, all the establishment to come together and say, no, it has to be Biden. It can't be Sanders. So he may be the beneficiary of COVID, because I really don't know what his campaign would be like if he was expected to be out there doing events and doing things, because he's flopped at that every time he's done it, and certainly flopped in the most recent effort in the nomination.
Well, you asked him about and used the analogy of the Trudeau low bridging strategy. There's no question. I think he has been benefited by being virtually invisible during COVID, and that whereas Trump is kind of front and center all the time. The more you look at Trump, the more some Americans have some difficulty. But I mean, you're right. I don't even think it was the establishment that brought Biden back. I think it was South Carolina, because it exposed all the other candidates as being completely unable to attract African American and Hispanic voters, which clearly are the cornerstone of Democratic support today. And to that, the establishment says if these candidates can't do that, then they're not qualified to be the nominee of this party.
All right. Okay, let's get on to domestic issues. This is the month that the CERB is ending for people. People are starting to receive their last CERB checks, and the Prime Minister has promised a replacement revamped EI program and some other program to help people that wouldn't qualify for EI. The jobs data indicate that some jobs are coming back, maybe lots of jobs are coming back, but it's also pretty obvious that lots of jobs in certain sectors are not coming back for a long time, if ever. How is the government going to survive this? I mean, the CERB so protected people from the loss of income that they had that they've felt relatively insulated, and they've been able to focus pretty much exclusively on the health impacts of COVID. But now the economics of COVID are going to become a lot more real to people. And Allan, Jenni, and I have been talking about this for a while, about how this is the dangerous political period for governments, not the actual pandemic outbreak in April and in March and April, but now, as you start to have to withdraw these income supports and the economy is still weak.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this government has been pretty fleet of foot in terms of bringing forward, fairly creative policy responses, economic responses to the economic shutdown, which are obviously is artificially induced by a policy response as well. I mean, we haven't seen what they're going to do in terms of the replacement of CERB. They've acknowledged that unemployment insurance as it's structured right now does not work, because it covers only about 42% of workers are eligible for EI, so that they somehow got to tweak it so that gig workers and people who do not normally have the qualifications for EI continue to have some kind of support system, because you're right. I mean, if you're in the hospitality sector, if you're in the hotel business, if you're in the airline business, you're going to have troubles for the foreseeable future, and those kind of support systems are going to have to be in there. To what extent people would make the linkage and blame government if they all of a sudden are starting to feel financial hardships, hard to tell. I mean, I've looked at a lot of data during this COVID thing, and I kept on saying to anyone who would listen, if I was Jagmeet Singh, I would be wringing my hands with glee here. I mean, there is a real precondition for a strong, articulated left-of-center policy platform coming out of this that people would be very, very receptive to, but you just don't seem to be hear it coming from anyone right now.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious to see what third party they're going to hire to administer the new EI program that they're coming up with.
Oh, that's cynical. Well, that's a legitimate point. I mean, as I say, while I think they've been fairly fleet of foot in terms of policy response, the administration of some of this stuff is increasingly showing to be, full of cracks and arguably full of the potential for corruption as well.
And I agree with Allan. I actually think things like CERB, I think CRA deserves kudos for the administration of that program. People were able to apply through the online portal, and you were hearing reports back in April that people were getting their $2,000 payments within 5 days of applying. So I think the government did a great job on CERB in terms of the implementation of programs, but we haven't seen that with any of the other programs.
So, Jenni, what's the political vulnerability going forward for this government, do you think? Will it be the fact that they're not providing enough support for people through a recession, or will it be the astronomical deficits that are being built up?
I think the short term will be the lack of support for people. I think that the deficit and the net debt, the fact that we have a $1.2 trillion net debt, that's going to end up, that is going to be I'm not saying long term, but that's going to be a problem for another day for this government or another government. But I think that as people transition off the CERB, as there was 500,000 jobs added to the economy in July. Most of those part-time jobs, and we'll see how long they actually last if people are laid off again. And so I think that every government, Liberals included, and are going to face the challenge of the economic hardships, as I said about COVID. I think that as companies start to restructure and as the world gets used to this so-called new normal, I think that there's been a lot of people that have kept their jobs working from home that probably still expect to keep their jobs working from home, and that's not going to end up being the case in the next 6 months as I said, companies get used to this new normal and get used to who are essential staff and who are not. And I'm assuming we're going to get into this. Add that with the ongoing stories of ethical breaches and giving money to their friends. If you're sitting and you've lost your job and you can't pay your rent or you can't pay your mortgage, and you're seeing that all these friends and families of the Prime Minister's office and their staff are getting giant contracts to administer programs that they're not qualified to administer, you're kind of like, what gives?
Yeah, I think Jenni's right. I mean, one of the things historically you could always count on is the business community would rail against deficit spending. I mean, you're hearing nothing. You look at the releases from the Chamber or the National Business Council. We've got $1.2 trillion. It's almost. I was watching a documentary on Ronald Reagan the other day, and he was very concerned in 1982 that the U.S. deficit was going to be $100 billion. Ours is 1.2 trillion. So that doesn't seem to be an issue short term. I don't know. It's so much economic hardship. I think Jenni touched on it. It's more empathy and an understanding. And the vulnerability of the Liberal government, I think, is that they talk this great game about the middle class and those who aspire to it. Yet they on the other hand, they demonstrate no kind of sense that they are like those very people that they want to help so much. I mean, when was the last time, as the finance minister did, you took your family on 2 holidays that cost you $92,000, and that, oh, by the way, you just forgot to pay $41,000 of that, so that morning you wrote a check out of your checking account for your $41,000. People just go, whoa. And Justin Trudeau doesn't seem to think that there's anything crazy. Everyone's mom and their brother gets paid $500,000 in fees and expenses to go swan around and drink cocktails with potential sponsors for a charity. This is normal. So I think it's that gap between kind of the talk and the life, really, that causes a lot of people to say, are these guys for real or not?
Well, how much life does Bill Morneau have left in him after the Globe and Mail this morning? That seems like a deliberate spoon feed from the Prime Minister's office to the Globe and Mail to tell them that the finance minister no longer has the confidence of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's exactly what it seems like. If I was Bill Morneau or anyone working for him right now, it is not a good morning, so to speak.
And it's highly unusual. I mean, the finance minister is usually the one cabinet minister that's sacrosanct, that's untouchable. You protect your finance minister, and you can go back for as long as you want. Really to Walter Gordon almost. And that the finance minister was always held in very high regard by the prime minister, by the colleagues, and they were protected no matter what kind of trouble they got into. Today's story is preceded by yesterday's story that Mark Carney is coming back from governor of the Bank of England to be a special advisor. Whether he is, and his political aspirations have been well known for a long time. Whether he's prepared to run for Parliament and be the heir apparent to Morneau, we don't know yet. But it's beyond coincidence these two things are happening at the same time.
Yeah, not a lot of subtlety to it. I mean, I think that in addition to the ethical issues, a lot of people, including myself, have been wondering whether Morneau was really going to drive an economic agenda in the government and really was the guy to come forward with a recovery plan, because I hadn't seen that kind of leadership from him in this government before. So it may be that in addition to the ethical concerns, they've been looking for a reason to get rid of him.
Well, it can't be. They cannot say with a straight face that it has anything to do with the ethical concerns, because every single thing that we've talked about Bill Morneau doing, Justin Trudeau has done himself.
Yeah, he badly stumbled. I mean, we always seem to forget with the passage of time. He badly stumbled on the small business tax reform that caused terrible difficulty for the government. So he probably does not have an internal track record that is much admired. You can't think of, very much that he has done. And he's also, in terms of this entire COVID response, he seems to be taking a significant back seat to the center and to the prime minister's office in terms of these initiatives. So I would suspect that it has got much more to do with economic performance and a concern, to the point that Jenni was making, about how are we going to manage this recovery and how are we going to ensure that these people who are now going to be actually more financially vulnerable than they have been in the past respond politically to us.
I don't get the sense that Morneau ever had the political independence from the prime minister's office that the kind of finance ministers you're talking about, Allan, have had in the past. It didn't feel to me like he was an independent power source in that government at any point.
I think you're right.
Well, I think this government generally is very centralized. I know that everyone likes to talk about Stephen Harper's government, to which I spent I was there the entire time we were in government, and our government was not nearly as centralized as what you see how the Trudeau government operates. So I don't think it's just Morneau in the finance minister's office. I think it's generally like that with every minister's office.
Well, centralization, Jenni, seems to build with every administration. It just seems to be an inexorable trend in the government that more and more decision-making is brought into the prime minister's office.
Well, there's been a big leap from when I was in the prime minister's office to Trudeau, because I can tell you, Jim Flaherty he was not running every decision by Prime Minister Harper or the prime minister's office. He had the autonomy to be the finance minister, and so did senior ministers John Barrett in foreign affairs and what have you. So I think with this, they obviously see Morneau. He's been a weak finance minister, to Allan's point. There have been major files. That being said, they did reappoint him after the small business tax measures screw up. That was the spring of 2017, and they did reappoint him in the fall as finance minister. But they're obviously eyeing Carney to take this role, be it behind the scenes or in an elected fashion. And yesterday there was, people like John Ivison were tweeting that Carney would like to run, for example, in Ottawa-Vanier, which is a very bold choice for him. It's very hard to make the decision to come back after being away a decade and run in the safest Liberal seat in the entire country. It's very, very, he's really doing public service.
We all know that dictatorships are more efficient than the democracies. I'm not suggesting we have a dictatorship, but there's no question the more you move towards centralization, the easier it is to control things. It's also easier to make big mistakes absent that kind of consultation. And it's also much easier for vulnerabilities to occur at the top. So you've got a vested interest in doing both. You've got a vested interest in centralizing because it's easier to govern, but you also have a vested interest in having some kind of collegiality so that you can spread responsibility around. And I agree with Jenni that there's been an ongoing trend going right back to Trudeau. I remember, Marc Lalonde writing papers and and Michael Pitfield writing papers about this is when they first created the PMO and the PCO, and putting bureaucracy and machinery of government behind the prime minister. We forget that there was a time when that didn't exist, and now there's no question that the PMO and the PCO are the most powerful points of decision making in government, far and away.
I don't know that you could run the government any other way, though, Allan.
It's so unwieldy between the federalism and the fact that we are now it's a $250 billion operation even pre-COVID, 250,000 employees. It's a big operation. There's no CEO in this country that has anything that even comes close to the government of Canada, and a lot of business leaders forget that. It's a massive enterprise, and deputy ministers who are running things like the Defense Department are running operations that are way bigger than the Royal Bank or Canadian Railroads or any place else out there.
Yeah, but listen, there's always going to be some centralization, but you also put people in your cabinet who are smart, capable people to be able to run different departments and that you trust. And seemingly what we have seen now, and the latest on the rent subsidy program, what we're seeing is you basically have a government who is making decisions that seemingly are made to benefit friends and family in their administration. They are putting the interests of people like small business owners behind seemingly personal interests of people that work in their government.
Well, I don't know if their motives are that quite malevolent, but the larger issue is that they don't seem to have a kind of a screen that tells them this is a problem.
No, that's a cop out. I'm sorry, if nobody sitting around that cabinet table was smart enough to realize that there was a conflict with the Kielburgers and the Prime Minister's office, then they actually should all be removed from cabinet, because that makes them the most tone deaf people. Like if the Prime Minister, he himself tried to then claim that there was an ethical screen or that he had an ethical problem with it, but it was basically shoved down his throat by the public service. They're like, it's a binary choice. It's we or not this program. And when we go into like the rent subsidy program, this is a cabinet that decided to give it to CMHC, a Crown Corp whose sole job they say is to ensure affordable housing for all Canadians. They in no way have been anywhere close to be able to delivering a subsidy program. So they made that choice to put it into CMHC instead of having CRA do it with the same way that they did the CERB. I'm a small business owner. I have a portal with CRA. It could have been easy. If I had applied for the rent subsidy program, I could have applied and CRA would have known if I had lost 70% of my business from last year to now. So this government sat around and made a very poor decision, and who knows what it was based upon, but they made a poor decision to give it to a Crown Corp who had absolutely no able, just like they did to be able to deliver this program. And now there is 1.1 million small businesses, and people are going out of business on a weekly basis, and only 70,000 people have been able to do all the dotting of the I's and crossing of the T's of the mammoth application process and actually have this program delivered to them. So this is competency, but there is no screen that needs to be done. They're making the choices.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the operations of government to know whether they're capable of doing these things in-house or outsourced. But the only reason we know about this is because, and this goes to the point that I was trying to make, is it's an absence of kind of understanding that these things are problematic, that they gave it to an organization that employed the husband of the chief of staff of the Prime Minister of Canada. That should have set up the signal. Certainly politically, that this is going to be a problem. When they gave the recontract that Trudeau said himself, he said, I wanted more due diligence. Well, they did. What kind of due diligence did they end up doing when they actually gave the contract, given what we subsequently know happened?
Well, but Allan, you know what people say inside in these circumstances? They say, what? So this company is supposed to be disqualified from this work because they employ Rob Silver? They want a competitive tender? They thought that as a company they did everything correct. Why should they be punished?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, having been kind of in the public eye for all of my professional life, I think that it is wrong that we set up such discriminatory practices that people are actually dissuaded from entering the public life. That's a huge problem if we want to have a healthy democracy with the best and the brightest attracted to it. But I also believe that we've got ethical standards, and that Mr. Silver should have recused himself from any kind of dealings with CMHC and made sure that he wasn't at meetings in a Crown Corporation's office where they were negotiating an $84 million contract that is public funds. I mean, that's just common sense to me.
But this is my issue. You guys, the Liberals actually want us to turn this into a debate as to whether Katie Telford set up an ethical screen. I'm sure she did everything by the books. That's not the point of this. The point of the matter is why was a third party selected to administer this program that easily could have been administered by the public service? This is exactly like we. So like everyone's like doing smoke and mirrors over here that this is about an ethical screen. No, why did this government give $84 million to a third party to administer a program, a rent subsidy program that could have easily been administered by CRA? They gave it to
Jenni, why is it impossible? Jenni, why is it impossible that in the midst of COVID, with the bureaucracy being called upon to do things, come up with programs, do things that they've never been asked to do before, everybody in the country being asked to do things they've never done before, why is it inconceivable that they would have said to a few things, listen, we are overtaxed. This is something we need to subcontract out to somebody. We don't have the bandwidth right now to do this.
Well, they absolutely had. They had the bandwidth. There is small businesses have portals within CRA right now. CRA was able to deliver the CERB seemingly, as I said, within 5 days. They easily could have done the rent subsidy program the exact same way. It's not this is the crux of the issue. This could have been administered by CRA, by the government, by officials within the government, just like Canada Summer Jobs, if they really wanted to help students, could have been this Canada Student Grant Program could have been administered by the officials that did the Canada Summer Jobs Program.
Okay, but there should be documentary evidence of this one way or another, right? I mean, if the bureaucracy was saying we don't have the bandwidth to do this and we need to sub this out, there would be documentary evidence of that, right?
Well, we've been asking to see documentary evidence about the public service recommending that we was the only charity in the entire country that could administer the Canada Summer the Student Grant Program, and we've yet to see that. And now we know that actually they didn't have the capacity because they had to hire a government relations firm to administer the program in Quebec. So if these
I will say that National providing the thing in Quebec does start to make the argument that they were the only organization who could possibly do it. Does weaken that argument somewhat.
If these documents existed from the public service, the Liberals this government would already have released them. They don't exist.
So what are you expecting from Shugart at committee?
Well, we'll see what he says. But if I'm the public service, including Shugart, Justin Trudeau changed his tone. We talked about this last week. His tone went from the public service recommended this to basically the public service shoved this program down my throat. And even I thought the Republicans.
Yeah, they jammed me. They jammed me with this thing.
They jammed me. This was all them. So we'll see what he says at committee, but it's his professional reputation as well as the reputation of a lot of hardworking public servants to whether they're going to eat shit for this government.
Allan, you've seen a lot of scandals in your life. This one have legs? This one going to do damage?
Compared to what's happening in Belarus or Lebanon, I mean, this is pretty small beer. I mean, the wee scandal, you've got a scandal that no one benefited, no one kind of lost any money. So that said, it's a scandal, so-called, that the average person could understand. Here, there appeared to be some form of favoritism going to an organization that had direct ties and in turn had that quid pro quo favors for a family member to the Prime Minister of Canada. That's pretty easy for me to understand. As I said earlier, I think the vulnerability is not so much in the actual act, and I have no idea, it's beyond my competency to know what the organizational capacity of governments is, whether they should be outsourcing or not outsourcing. It's the fact that people in government didn't realize this was going to cause a problem, that there was something really stinky about this, and that it would continue to have legs because it is understandable and it's stinky. And you put those two things together and you have a political liability.
So do you think it's best at this point, given how, let me put it this way, do you think the government has suffered all the damage it's going to suffer on this, and so they should just keep their heads down and plow through? Or do you think this is an ongoing problem that needs to be cauterized by a firing or something like that?
I don't think firing Marneau is going to stem the bleeding of we or the rent subsidy program, and it just raises more questions. If they want, this has shown they could have thrown all of this stuff out or admitted things back on July 2nd or July 3rd when all of the stuff on we started to come out. And I think what it is if I'm the opposition or I'm the media, the next questions are, okay, so here we're talking about two programs that were outsourced. Let's go through every government announcement that Trudeau did from March to like May in terms of program, and ask how these programs are being implemented by the federal government. Is it being done in-house, or has there been another firm or an outside agency that's been tasked with delivering the program? So I just think it opens a lot of questions. They have not managed this issue very efficiently or well. There was a lot of things they could have thrown out. All the stuff on they could have thrown out at the very beginning, and there would have been a ton of information, but it all would have been out at once. And seemingly what they do is every day or two, something just drips out that leads to more questions about how we got to where we are now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think it's a scandal per se that is a political liability. It is what the scandal does to the brand on a continuing basis. So this is the third time the Prime Minister has had an ethical investigation. This is the same guy who was serial blackface, didn't think anything was weird about that. Finance Minister not just wrote a $41,000 check that morning, he forgot that he had a chateau in France. And it's not just that they're rich and privileged, is that they don't have any real sense that their life is completely different than everyone else's life. At the same time, they talk this great game about how they care about the little guy and offer no evidence that they really understand the little guy. And that's where the brand vulnerability is. This was something in 2015 that was actually a Trudeau strength, and I think the very thing that a lot of people liked in 2015 is now starting to really irritate them in 2020.
Well, I think that is a solid note on which to end our conversation. I want to thank you both. This was super interesting. Allan, what a great addition to the pod you were. Thanks for making the time to do it. I forgot to mention that I have a book recommendation this week, and that is What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer. Inspired by my interview with John Anzalone about Joe Biden, this book, I chose this book because this book is one of the best books on politics that I have ever read. It takes each of the serious candidates for the Republican and Democratic nominations in 1988 and examines them from a perspective of what do you have to do? What kind of person do you have to be? What do you have to do with your life to get to be a serious candidate for the presidency? What It Takes. I highly recommend it, and tons of insights into Joe Biden in this book. Jenni and Allan, again, thank you very much, and thank John Anzalone. Turn the Ray Martini music up a little bit so people can hear that tune a little bit louder. Thank you all for tuning in this week. We'll be back, of course, next week. If you like the show, give us a shout out on social media or go to iTunes or your other provider and rank and rate us. And thanks as always for listening. And we'll see you and talk to you next week.